All right, Dr. Hatcher, we are ready to begin.
Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everyone. I appreciate your coming to this, the 23rd session in this combination course and fireside about the Baha'i faith and its teachings. It is my hope that my presentation tonight and on each Wednesday at the same time will help stimulate thoughtful questions, useful answers, an abundance of sharing, and in the long run, an overview of the Baha'i teachings, its history, its administrative order, and its sacred text. Of course, as always, I remind you that these discussions are based on my understanding. What I say has no special authority, though I do base my observations and conclusions on my understanding of texts that are authoritative. Also, let me remind you that my ultimate goal is to provide you with tools for your own study, not to impose on you my personal observations. As you probably know, there is no clergy in the Baha'i faith, nor is there a recognized class of scholars. Every Baha'i is encouraged to study the Baha'i teachings independently, to discuss the teachings in gatherings such as this, and to teach others when the opportunity arises. These classes are not intended to substitute for the Rui Institute courses or study circles, which are offered worldwide for Baha'is and the public in general, to learn about the Baha'i teachings and how to put that learning into practice in order to help transform the individual, the neighborhood, and ultimately to create the framework for a global community. After my discussion of tonight's topic, Alex Kolodner, director and producer of this online course, will select questions that you have typed into chat, which you can designate for everyone or only for Alex if you would rather remain anonymous. Do try to make your questions relevant to the topic for the evening. Finally, as usual, let me express my appreciation to my wife, Lucia, who helps me every week in creating and editing these presentations, and who, as usual, will begin tonight's class with a reading she has selected for this class. And this particular reading is very cryptic, but extremely powerful. So you might want to pay particular attention to it and recall it as we go through the course tonight. Lucia?
Okay, this is from the Tablets of Abdu'l-Baha. The beloved of God must, like the roses of the rose garden, send fragrant messages from one to another, receive strength from one another, and cooperate together by the strength of the kingdom. There is no greater means than communion and communication.
Thank you. Before we begin tonight's PowerPoint presentation, I wanted to say a couple of words about where we are in the process of the course, because while Lucia assures me that I can talk about anything I want to, that I should talk about what I'm most interested in, after teaching at the graduate level and upper level courses for 44 years, I feel very nervous about going into a classroom situation without not only a plan for the class, but also a plan for where we are going in the course. So as you may recall, when we first started out in this course, we began with broad axioms about the relationship between religion and history, particularly the Abrahamic line of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and how the Baha'i concept that the religions actually propel human history and direct it, so that Abdu'l-Baha says without these revelations, the advent of these manifestations, that planet Earth would be the land of animal appetites and there would be no human progress. So before we get into the details of Baha'i history, which we are about ready to do with the Declaration of the Bab, which we'll begin discussing probably next week, and as well as the links, we have just a few links that we need to mention between Islam and the beginning of the Baha'i faith. I want to employ the same process of going over some important axioms that we will hopefully keep in mind as we go through the rest of the course. And so you remember 2 weeks ago, we examined the Baha'i theory of governance in class 21. And then last week in class 22, we discussed the covenant of Baha'u'llah and the various links that secure that relationship between God and humankind on planet, which is likened to a cord. We likened it to a chain. Baha'u'llah refers to it to this firm cord and so on, the firm handle. There are various metaphors he uses that are all equally powerful in demonstrating the fact that the covenant secures the religion in perpetuity if it's inviolable. And as we discussed last week, Baha'is believe that the covenant of Baha'u'llah is inviolable. This week for class 22, we're discussing, 23, we're discussing something that's a long-time favorite topic of mine. It's a very simple concept. It's about how we create action by a sort of a 3-part process. My brother called it a 4-part process, and tonight I'm going to do another variation on it. And this is the process of, as the title implies, knowledge, volition, and action, though I've changed the title since this afternoon, and it's called knowledge, volition, action, and habituation, because I realize that it's essential that we understand the process of becoming spiritual, whether as individuals or as an institution, requires that we establish certain habits. And so first, let me share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint. And there. Knowledge, volition, action, and habituation, a systematic process of advancement for individuals and the Baha'i administrative institutions. That's a long, big mouthful of a title. But it's actually a very simple concept. And it's simple as presented by Abdu'l-Baha, where we first come across this concept. But before we do that, I wanted to give a note of correction, or sometimes it's correction, sometimes it's just additional information. One thing we did not go over in the links of the covenant last week, which one of our attendees, I think, was asking about at the end of the class and never got a chance to go over it because I didn't want to have the rest of you miss out, is one thing we skipped over is what's called the interregnum between 1957 and 1963. This is, of course, the time between when the guardian died and when the House of Justice was elected. And it's called the interregnum, which is a Latin term, meaning between kingships. You have this in English history, and you have this in the Baha'i history in the time of the custodians, it's called. And it's discussed in detail in both my book, The Plan of God for Planet Earth, and in the Institute Study Circle Book 8. And it's very important. So, I mean, while we can or cannot see it as a separate autonomous link in the covenant, it's definitely a very important historical thing to know, because had the custodians not done their job, the election of the House of Justice might have been deterred in some way. So let us begin tonight with this concept of knowledge, volition, and action. And this is from the Foundations of World Unity by Abdu'l-Baha, and he says, very simply again, the attainment of any object is conditioned upon knowledge, volition, and action. Unless these 3 conditions are forthcoming, there is no execution or accomplishment. And then he goes on to give the metaphor or analogy of building a house. He says, in the erection of a house, it is first necessary to know the ground and design the house is suitable for it. Second, to obtain the means or funds necessary for the construction. Third, to actually build it. And so in this three-part process, and again, the fourth part we'll get to later, because it is only when you start repeating this process that you start seeing that it's not just back and forth like a pendulum, but it is reciprocal. We see it in the knowing and worshiping of God. The twin duties that are stated in the first paragraph of the Kitab-i Aqdas, where he says the two things incumbent upon us: first, to recognize the manifestation, and second, to follow whatever he ordains. And he goes on to say, Baha'u'llah does, these twin duties are inseparable, neither is acceptable without the other. Thus hath it been decreed by him who is the source of divine inspiration. Now, the same thing is true with these reciprocal twin duties of knowing and acting out, implicit at least in the noonday prayer. Part of it says, I bear witness, oh my God, thou hast created me to know thee and to worship thee. So you have knowledge and then action, because worship, as you know from the Baha'i writings, is not just prayer and supplication and reflection and meditation, but everything you do, work performed in the context of service in particular, but just work in general is considered worship. Whether it's in the spirit of sacrifice or simply to, as the last hidden word says, to earn enough to serve your family, for you to keep your family intact and so on. It becomes a three-part process when they are seen to be both reciprocal and inseparable from one another, as we've just seen, but progressive. Now, the progressive part means this, that anything you do, any attribute you're trying to develop is, as the writings say, infinitely refinable. One of the ways that it's stated by Abdu'l-Baha in some answered questions is that however spiritual and individual you may encounter, you can always imagine one more spiritual. Well, this is true with both the collectivity of attributes as they occur in an individual, as we try to attain these or acquire these virtues. But it is also true with each attribute individually. So justice, for example, may start out very simply with doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so that's sort of a one-to-one concept of justice. And then you become ever more expansive in your understanding of justice. And the more understanding you have of what justice implies, the more expansive your actions will be. So this quote from Some Answered Questions is precisely what I was just getting at. There is no other being higher than a perfect man, but man, when he has reached this state, can still make progress in perfections, but not in state. That is, we will always be a human soul, whether in this life or the next, because there is no high state higher than that of a perfect man to which he can transfer himself. He only progresses in the state of humanity, for the human perfections are infinite. Thus, however learned a man may be, we can imagine one more learned. Hence, as the perfections of humanity are endless, man can also make progress in perfections after leaving this world. In other words, this process isn't confined to our mortal life, to our life in this world, but also in the world to come. So we can imagine that somehow this process is still at work as we progress, and we pray for the progress of souls who have passed on, that they are progressing by this same means. So the reciprocity between these duties is possible because material reality is a metaphorical expression of the spiritual world. Now, what does that mean? It means that, as we started out saying a long time ago, that material reality is a classroom for our learning, and that everything in creation has the capacity to reflect the attributes of God. And Baha'u'llah says, without that capacity, it wouldn't exist. that this is the whole purpose behind underlying creation. The spiritual world is likened to the phenomenal world. They are the exact counterpart of each other. And I've used this quote before, and I will use it again and again because it's so profound. Out of the waste of nothingness, with the clay of my command, I made thee to appear and have ordained for thy training every atom in existence and the essence of all created things. So there's an explicit statement of God saying through Baha'u'llah, everything in creation is to benefit your education and development. The action of teaching provides confirmations and power to progress. Now, one of the most important and obvious actions we can do, other than those prescribed for us as a daily course or a daily spiritual regimen, such as the saying the obligatory prayer, such as reflecting on the revealed scriptures in the morning and in the evening. One of the most important things we can do and are obliged to do, teach the cause, O people of Baha. Teaching is the source of divine confirmation. And again, teaching in a Baha'i context doesn't mean you're winning points or that you are doing this for your own benefit, but it does mean that you are, when you're doing this act of providing someone else information that will ultimately possibly change their entire life, that you will receive divine guidance and power. But Abdul Baha says in, this is Shoghi Effendi, states in this letter from 1957, it is not sufficient to pray diligently for guidance, but this prayer must be followed by meditation as to the best methods of action and then action itself. As you can see, implicit in that sentence is the very subject of our talk tonight, or our discussion tonight: knowledge, reflection, and on what you want to do, the volition, whereby the volition is accrued, and then the action itself. So you can have the best intentions in the world, but if you don't follow through with action, nothing is achieved thereby, or at least not as much. Even if the action should not immediately produce results, or perhaps not be entirely correct, that does not make so much difference, because prayers can only be answered through action. And if someone's action is wrong, God can use that method of showing the pathway which is right. So even if you don't do the right thing, you will be shown the difference. And we'll discuss later on as a passage that some of you are no doubt familiar with, which says even if an LSA makes a wrong decision, it should be adhered to by the participants in the community. And if it is wrong, the wrongness of it will become apparent, and then another decision can be made. But you shouldn't rebel at the decision because you personally don't think it's correct. That gets into the whole concept of consultation and how consultation should take place. This is a very nice analogy that I learned very early as a Baha'i from Abdul Baha, where he likens volition to the rudder of a ship. And he uses it in a couple of places. In one place, he says, if you are on a boat and you're in the water and you're moving along, the rudder is like your free will, your decision-making. Here, he talks about a ship, but the power of the ship is interesting. He likens that to the power that you receive in divine assistance. Also, the inaction or movement of man depend upon the assistance of God. If he is not aided, he is not able to do either good or evil. But when the help of existence comes from the generous Lord, he, notice the lowercase he, the individual, is able to do both good and evil. But if the help is cut off, he remains absolutely helpless. This is why the holy books they speak of, in the holy books, they speak of the help and assistance of God. So this condition is like that of a ship, which is moved by the power of the wind or steam. If this power ceases, the ship cannot move at all. Nevertheless, the rudder of the ship turns it to either side, and the power of the steam moves it in this desired direction. If it is directed to the east, it goes to the east, or if it's directed to the west, it goes to the west. This motion does not come from the ship. No, it comes from the wind or the steam. In the same way, in all the action or inaction of man, he receives power from the help of God, but the choice of good or evil belongs to the man himself. Very powerful statement about free will. So acquiring the ability to manifest and habituate attributes is necessarily a social process. Now, I've mentioned this before, and I'll mention it time and again because it's so important. And that is, spirituality is theoretical until it's put into action. And almost all virtues, as I've said before, love, justice, kindness, so on, I've mentioned a few here, are dependent on for their development on our interaction with other people. Otherwise, it's strictly theoretical. Since most virtues are understood and practiced in our relationship with others, love, justice, kindness, honesty, trustworthiness, forgiveness, and so on. You can imagine virtually all of these, with the exception of love and so on, is a virtue or an attribute or capacity that can only be discovered and really understood when it's put into practice with your relationships with other individuals. Then there is clearly a social imperative for the understanding and development of most virtues. And this, I wrote a book on called The Ascent of Society. The book deals with the fact that individual salvation is necessarily a social endeavor. 4, hence the prohibition of asceticism and monasticism from Baha'u'llah, that these, in effect, while there may have been a time in human history when such practices had value as setting an example for the community, now is the time for the priests, the monastics, to come out of seclusion and participate in the world, both for their own benefit and for that of society. So he says the following: in the words of Paradise, Baha'u'llah amplifies these provisions. He states, living in seclusion or practicing asceticism is not acceptable in the presence of God, and he calls upon those involved to observe that which will cause joy and radiance, obviously to others and also to themselves. He instructs those who have taken up their abodes in the caves of the mountains, or who have repaired to graveyards at night, and that's an allusion to something you may not be familiar with, to abandon these practices. And he enjoins them not to deprive themselves of the bounties of this world, which have been created by God for humankind. And in the tablet of Bishkara, which, while acknowledging the pious deeds of monks and priests, Baha'u'llah calls upon them to give up the life of seclusion and direct their steps towards the open world and busy themselves with that which will profit themselves and others. He also grants them leave to enter into wedlock, that they may bring forth one who will make mention of God. So this is in a note to the Kitab-i-Iqdas, which the note is on page 195. So here is the concept of what my brother in his work on the concept of spirituality calls the virtuous circle. What I call, I use various metaphors, but I call it in this an ascending pendulum, and another I call a gyre or gyre. Usually I think the pronunciation is gyre, and you'll see how that works. But the idea is that this whole sequence repeats itself in a reciprocity that is ever advancing. So you go from knowledge and meditation and reflection on a plan for applying knowledge to volition and action, and then you have an outcome, and then from that outcome you understand more, And from that newer understanding, you can increase the level of your volition, action, and outcome. And so you end up with this sort of gyre where you have this sort of ascending cycle of reciprocity and spiritual advancement. So knowledge, volition, action, expanded knowledge, volition, expanded action. Now, we haven't gotten to habituation yet, but we'll see it. So here's another way of looking at it. This is the pendulum effect, or the pendulum metaphor. So you begin with let's say, the action of love, or the virtue of love and the implementation of it. So you begin, as you can see, on the right column is knowledge, the left column is knowledge, the right column is action, and you go from the love of self, and so you develop the habits of being clean, of determined, focused, to expand to the love of family, whereby you are, again, the beginnings of social training of virtue, insofar as love is concerned. You're cheerful, you're helpful, you're kind, you're courteous. Those are the actions that demonstrate the love you have for your family. And then you expand your circle of love wider to embrace the love of friends, where you are exhibiting such aspects or actions demonstrating love as reliability, trustworthiness, available, I say, which is an interesting one, I feel. And then you go beyond the immediate friends to the community itself, where you are demonstrating your love by being charitable and a source of unity, of concern and care. And of course, with the core activities, that would include education of children, of junior youth, study circles, devotions, and so on. And then finally, or not finally, but even more advanced, we embrace the country. We are exhorted to be, admonished to be, as Baha'is, faithful citizens, lawful, dutiful, responsible, regardless of what we think of the government. And so this is very important. Finally, the widest expanse of our love, at least in this life, is our love of humankind as a whole. And that's our ultimate goal, of course, as Baha'is, is to create a worldwide or global community where these kinds of actions can be expressed in creative global systems. So we are advocates of peace, of justice, of human rights, and so on, and all that those encompass, which is a lot of different courses of action that we are being challenged to exhibit right now. So, reflection and meditation. Now, this is an interesting thing. I think I've mentioned it before, but if I haven't, pay close attention to this. This is a definition of the value of internal, what I call internal consultation, and you'll see why in just a second. The process of reflection and meditation, when we are trying to gain knowledge or perhaps reflect on how we will apply that knowledge before we undertake the volition to put it into effect. But it's kind of involved with the first and second steps of knowledge and volition. And these passages are really quite profound. Baha'u'llah says there is a sign from God in every phenomenon. The sign of the intellect is contemplation, and the sign of contemplation is silence, because it is impossible for a man to do two things at one time. He cannot both speak and meditate. Now, this is also something I learned, or at least was discussed very importantly in the martial arts when we were talking about action and silence and action, which is yang in Korean, or yin yang in Japanese or Chinese rather, and it has to do with the reciprocity of action and reflection, that you can't do one while you're doing the other. Now, these are quotes from Abdu'l-Baha that get into this in more detail. It is an axiomatic fact that while you meditate, you are speaking with your own spirit. Now you see why I'm calling this internal consultation. You're actually consulting, your rational mind is consulting with your spirit. And I'm sure you've all experienced this, that you can, put a question to yourself and you receive an answer. And this is what Abdu'l-Baha says. In that state of mind, you put certain questions to your spirit, and the spirit answers. The light breaks forth and reality is revealed. He goes on to say, you cannot apply the name man to any being void of this faculty of meditation. Without it, he would be a mere animal, lower than the beasts. Through the faculty of meditation, man attains to eternal life. Through it, he receives the breath of the Holy Spirit. The bestowal of the Spirit is given in reflection and meditation. So you see how important this is, not just once in a while, but as a daily exercise. And of course, the Baha'i writings, or at least the letters from the House of Justice, make it very clear, and from the Guardian, that there is not, nor will there ever be, some specific or explicit form of meditation. And so far as do we do certain gestures or something. So, maybe you do yoga and you find in, say, a certain pose that you're inclined to. Certainly the, in part, you have in the long obligatory prayer certain moves that are very much like certain yoga poses, and particularly what's called the perfect posture, or the sitting with your legs crossed and so on, which is advised for the part where you're sitting as part of the long obligatory prayer. Through the faculty of meditation, man attains to eternal life. Through it, he receives the breath of the Holy Spirit. The bestowal of the Spirit is given in reflection and meditation. So it's absolutely crucial. And notice this is distinct, if you will, from prayer. Perhaps it's something that would be very conducive to occurring after you have prayed, or setting your mind in order before you pray, but it's distinct from it. It's just a different thing. The spirit of man is itself informed and strengthened during meditation. Through it, affairs of which man knew nothing are unfolded before his view. Through it, he receives divine inspiration. Through it, he receives heavenly food. There's another passage which I didn't include in this, but where Abdu'l-Baha says that if you want to solve a problem, you just let your mind focus on it. And like a light focused on something, eventually it breaks through. And I'm sure many of you have experienced that throughout your life as a person aspiring to become spiritual. Then we come to habituation. And this is really, as I feel, not simply an ancillary step. I think it's integral to the other three steps of knowledge, volition, and action, and habituation, which is what is implicit in that spiral of the gyre, or that pendulum, ascending pendulum. Whether you're talking about your own life as a Baha'i or the community itself. As an individual, habituation is important in such things as education, vocation, dress, language, the arts, manners, personal relationships, prayer and meditation, studying the writings, and so forth. These habits of chastity and so on. I use the analogy sometimes when I'm talking about this in a fireside as regard to the Baha'i life and the Baha'i regimen that Baha'u'llah has established for us. That if you, that habit, that habituation is freedom. that if you establish the habit that you make up your bed after you get up and go through your routine of brushing your teeth, washing your face, so on, that that you don't want to waste that free will, that precious free will, that energy that it requires on something trivial. So if you habituate the lower levels of cleanliness, of manners, of personal relations and prayer and so on, then you can focus that free will on the higher expressions of these, of attaining a chaste and holy life, as the Guardian discusses at length. So one example of this process is profoundly expressed in the Rui study circles, the Institute courses, because especially with the first ones that are very conducive to having non-Baha'is, especially those who are not used to prayer or reflection or even belief in God, go through the process of not just talking about prayer or reading a prayer or studying a prayer, but of practicing them, learning concepts related to different areas of spiritual and social understanding, deciding to put that knowledge into some creative expression. And these expressions can be either directed, of course, by the tutor, or the tutor can instruct the members of the study circle to come up with some creative expression that they can share at the next meeting. Practicing the concepts in action at both the individual and social level in order to develop the core or foundational building block of an advanced society, the collaborative, just, and spiritually inspired neighborhood. And of course, that's where you go beyond the individual level of practicing these virtues, and you do it collectively. And this can be done, of course, inspired by devotionals. So if you think about it, the activities of the study circle, new knowledge, and of course the actions that those usually incorporate, and then the children's classes and junior youth classes, which are a means by which you can put that into action. And then the devotions are the same thing in this. So you have sort of this three-part process in the devotions, where you acknowledge the study circles, where you see ways of putting that knowledge in action, and then the actions themselves, the largest expression of which is creating the neighborhood, which is the framework that we have worldwide. So habituating these actions then is so important. And we see this so much on the, those of you who've had the experience being in clusters where you have these cycles of activity, and you try to make those cycles advancing, habituating one level of action so that you can, as a community, go to an ever more expansive or advanced level of action. And this is a talk I used to give at junior youth classes and youth classes at permanent Baha'i schools. It was a course called Habit and Discipline as the Keys to Freedom. I even wrote a little article about it for Brilliant Star one time, a long time ago. And it's a simple idea, but it's a very profound one. And that is, if you are, this is where it is incumbent, I feel, upon the parent to teach habit and discipline to the child, that it ultimately is creating for them a kind of freedom. And freedom, and again, in the sense that they don't have to use that creative portion of their free will to do minimal or menial tasks, that they can use it on something more complex and a higher level, if you will, of human development. The more we habituate a healthy regimen, the less we need to dedicate our precious free will to minimal levels of refinement, eating, cleanliness, prayer, reading the writings, exercise, etc. Practicing the concepts in action at both the individual and social level in order to develop the core or foundational building blocks of an advanced society, collaborative justice, and spiritually inspired neighborhood. Habituating these actions, and then we're able to focus our reflection on the more lofty and complex matters. Always in the writings and in my own writing, I have found that the most useful analogy for understanding and teaching others about these concepts of spiritual development as a reciprocal process or as a process is the analogy of physical training, physical development. No matter how hard you work out today, unless you develop a regimen and train over time, no abiding progress will result. It's very much like eating, for example, is another example. You can eat the most healthy meal that has ever been created, and then 24 hours later, at least, you will need nourishment again. So unless there is resistance, you will remain only as strong as you were. Now we're off the food and going back to working out, development. If you only, in other words, if you want to become a runner, a seasoned runner, or if running will keep you in shape, if you only run the same distance every day, you will attain some minimal level of health. But you want to press against resistance. And that's true. And again, remember, this is an analogy. So you're always trying to increase your limits, whether you are praying, reading the writings, or expressing what you've learned in action. And here's some trivial examples, but they work. Is making your bed, washing the dishes, or maintaining personal cleanliness worthy of free will? Okay, well, it requires some just to organize which day you're going to do it on. But presumably, if you do it on a schedule and so on, you're not using a great deal of your free will. If we strive to maintain a healthy diet until it becomes habituated, then soon unhealthy foods, once so appealing, become repugnant. At such a point, little free will or discipline, it should be discipline singular, is required for these endeavors. Yet if, for whatever reason, one allows these actions to degrade, then the process of knowledge, volition, action, and habituation will be required to regain health. So if for whatever reasons, perhaps it's illness, we have to bring ourselves back up to where we were before we became ill. If we become spiritually ill, or for whatever reason are unable or unwilling to pursue a spiritual discipline, then we have to sort of start over again and retrain ourselves. Now, this process, I believe, and this sort of finishes up the discussion, is also applicable to our institutions. And that is when we consult as an institution, whether you're on an LSA or a committee of an LSA or an NSA, you're going through the same process. It's discussed a great deal in the Rui book 10, section unit 2 on consultation. But there are these stages or steps that Abdu'l-Baha advises us to go through when we consult on a matter. First, find out the facts, find out the spiritual principles involved in what you're trying to do, whether you're trying to solve a problem or come up with some creative way of teaching and so on. And then you decide to carry out that action, and then you do it, and you do it over. Now, what I'm referring to here more precisely, however, is not a particular course of action that an LSA would take, but the act of consulting itself. It is an incredibly subtle skill to acquire. And those of you who have served on such institutions, even perhaps business consultation, you know how crucial it is to develop the habits that are described in the Baha'i writings as essential for good consultation. Respect for others, tone of voice, expression of face, very subtle things. The manifestation reveals both new knowledge and social order, a restatement of the eternal and changeless spiritual verities together with more expansive understanding of the eternal plan of God. The ever-advancing and continually more refined system of governance, whereby new knowledge can be implemented in society from the individual to the planetary level and eventually perhaps beyond. Baha'u'llah reveals a major doctrinal knowledge in Persian, the Kitab-i-Igan, and the laws, ordinances, and exhortations for implementing this expanded knowledge or understanding in Arabic, the Kitab-i-Aqdas. That's not merely a coincidence that one language is more adept at talking about spiritual matters and one is better for articulating law. The Baha'i administration is likewise upheld by two complementary branches or pillars. It is incumbent upon everyone to aid those daysprings of authority and sources of command who are adorned with the ornament of equity and justice. Blessed are the rulers and the learned among the people of Baha'i. Now, what are these two groups of people? They are my trustees among my servants and the manifestations of my commandments amidst my people. Upon them rest my glory, my blessings, and my grace, which have pervaded the world of being. In this connection, the utterances revealed in the Kitab-i-Aqdas are such that from the horizon of their words, the light of divine grace shineth luminous and resplendent. And of course, that's the Kitab-i-Aqd, the covenant, the book of the covenant, effectively the will and testament of Baha'u'llah. Now, who are the rulers and the learners? The learned are those like the Guardian, the Hands of the Cause, the International Teaching Center, the counselors, their auxiliary board members, and their assistants, who provide not authoritative decisions, but who counsel various bodies. So the counselors, the International Teaching Center guides the continental counselors. The counselors in each continent consult with and advise and are actually in status above the national spiritual assemblies. The auxiliary board members consult with and advise the local assemblies and are above them in status. The assistants to the auxiliary board members are usually within the community, members of the LSA perhaps, and assist in any way they can by communicating problems, for example, to the auxiliary board, or by, in some cases, offering to assist or consult with local assemblies. The rulers, the Guardian and the House of Justice, were at one time, the Guardian had to be both the learned and the ruler, and so did the House of Justice. But they are twin institutions in another sense, and we'll see how that works. So under the House of Justice, the ultimate executive body of the faith, you have the secondary houses of justice, which are now called the National Spiritual Assemblies, then the local houses of justice, which are now called the local spiritual assemblies. And at each level, the same three steps are apparent. In other words, you have the gaining of new knowledge on the part of the institution, the reflection and consultation on the application of that knowledge to resolution of a problem or the creation of a plan, the carrying out of that plan of action, the reflection on the knowledge gained by that action, consulting on how the plan of action can be improved, carrying out the refined plan of action. So again, you see this reciprocity, this circle, and how it becomes ever more refined. And so the underlying process in the framework for action is exemplified particularly in the reflection gathering that you have periodically in your cluster. At this meeting, the cluster reflects on its recently accomplished, completed cycle of activity, its actions, and considers the plans for its next cycle, reflection on the action. The Universal House of Justice recommends that these reflection meetings be more occasions of joyous celebration rather than unremittingly serious administrative gatherings. So they're supposed to be lighthearted and conversational, and yet you are also planning for the next cycle of activity, of reflection and, of action and then reflection on that action and so on. And yet, in as much as these are sessions for future action, they require these same components: reflection to assess knowledge gain, planning to assess future action, volition on the part of the participants to follow through, and carrying out the plan systematically so that the process becomes habituated and hopefully ever more expansive and refined. So, the habituation of healthy consultation internally, bring yourself into account each day. You can certainly use your reflection and meditation as described by Alda Baha as a process for doing that. At the level of the LSA or any of its committees, at the level of the NSA or its committees, at the level of the House of Justice or any of its committees. And as I said, Study Circle Book 10, Unit 2 is an in-depth comprehension of the practice of this very essential skill. So finally, we have this slide that I've showed you before of the administration of the Baha'i Faith as it is currently, including the institute process, as you can see there. And what you have then is the information reports about activity, consultation, reflection, guidance for action. And so the information comes from the community up through these agencies of the Auxiliary Board to the Continental Counselors to the International Teaching Center, which is informing with statistics and other information the House of Justice, which consults, makes decisions about what action to carry through, and then advises the national assemblies, who in turn oversee the local assemblies, and the National Assembly, local assemblies, and the regional councils are all helping the cluster itself. It then also goes back down this way where the information that the House of Justice has decided to take is conveyed very crucially through the institution of the learned. So we close with our picture of the Harami Agdas again, so beautiful. And that's the end of our discussion for tonight. And I'm now willing, went a little longer than I thought it would, but let's take about 10 or 15 minutes of questions if you have any. And so I turn it over to you, Alex. Let me stop sharing my screen. And there we go.